Welcome to the Surrogacy Warrior podcast with your host, Kimberly Surratt. Join us as we dive deep into the heart of surrogacy, offering insights, sharing stories, and providing advice. Our mission is to illuminate every corner of surrogacy, from the emotional roller coasters and legal battles to the triumphant moments of birth and beyond. Surrogacy Warrior is more than just a podcast. It's a community for anyone touched by or interested in the transformative power of surrogacy. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, lawyersforfamilies.com. Now here's the host of Surrogacy Warrior, Kimberly Surratt.
Welcome, everybody, to Surrogacy Warrior. I'm Kim Surratt, your host, passionate advocate for creating families through surrogacy and other assisted reproduction. I have an amazing, very long-term friend at this point with me, Natalie Gamble, who is in the UK. She is an attorney. For those of you that are listening in the United States, that's a word we use. But Natalie, why don't you introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your history and how you got into this area of law for us?
Sure. So I'm based over here in the UK, and I got into this area of law because I built my own family through donor conception with my wife. My daughter's now just about to turn 22, which makes me feel ancient. But when we were going through our treatment, we kind of had to navigate how we were going to secure status for my wife. And there were just no lawyers in the UK that were doing this kind of work at that time. So we kind of muddled through things ourselves. And from there, I started advising other people, and really it just kind of grew and grew. So I was involved with the very first UK parents to go overseas for surrogacy, and then dealing with bringing their children back from, that was a Ukraine case in 2008. And since then, the practice has just grown and grown. So I set up NGA Law, which was the UK's first fertility law firm, in 2009, and we're the only law firm in the UK that specialises exclusively in assisted reproduction law. So we're a team of 15 of us now, and we also have a non-profit surrogacy agency called Brilliant Beginnings, which campaigns for better law in the UK and also helps advise people and facilitate surrogacy both in the UK and the US. So we have a whole kind of practical arm as well as the legal work that we do.
That's because you are a surrogacy warrior, and I adore you. So I love that you brought up that your first case was with Ukraine, because I want us to talk today to give. I really want to dive into the issue of the United States is not the only place to do surrogacy, and your first case was with the Ukraine, not with the United States. I think there's a lot of conception out there that US is the place to go, the only place to go. And that's not necessarily true. But tell me about the journey between UK and Ukraine, because obviously it's changed. If we look at, we're doing this podcast in June of 2024. And so for anybody that's up on politics and news, there was a major war in Ukraine. But let's talk a little bit about that and the drive for people. What drove them to the Ukraine to start with?
Yeah, and I mean, the UK is quite an interesting case study in terms of where people are going, because we have this legal process that happens after the birth of a child that parents have to go through to become the legal parents in the UK. And that gives us, if you like, a pool of data in terms of the court's information and statistics about where children are being born and therefore where parents are going for surrogacy. So if you look at the kind of the journey through all of that, you can see kind of different destinations rising and falling, and kind of the changes as things are changing with different regulations. So I think in those very early days of surrogacy, the place other than the US that was common to go was either India or the Ukraine. And India was very popular, but that ceased to be an option from 2015. And it was really after that Ukraine took off as the kind of the next most popular destination after the US in terms of international surrogacy. And then obviously in the last couple of years, that's fallen away for most parents because of the war that's going on there. So we can start to see kind of other destinations picking up, South America and Africa and so on. So it has been this kind of long journey of things moving, people moving from, or the surrogacy practice moving from place to place. And I guess if you look at the story as a whole in terms of answering your question about, what drives people to go to places other than the States, the US has always been the most popular destination for UK parents, but the reality is it's hugely expensive, and probably 2 to 3 times the cost of surrogacy in the next most expensive destinations. So when people are looking overseas, I mean, certainly a lot of the parents that I work with that go to places other than the States, it is simply a question of the US is not within their budget. So they're really looking at what's the best they can do within what they can afford. And people are always looking at, well, where are their services in terms of being able to be matched with a surrogate? Where is there law that supports surrogacy? And Ukraine was one of the few countries that had specific legislation on surrogacy that said that the intended parents, and still does, that the intended parents are the legal parents of the child. So it's a preferable destination to many of the other places where surrogacy happens because there is a legal framework for it. And the country as a whole has decided to accept and endorse and provide law for surrogacy. So it works very differently in Ukraine to the States, and it's much more kind of led by one organization. So the parents would engage a fertility clinic that also provides surrogacy matching services and some legal services and antenatal care. So you would have one organization that's managing the whole process. And typically parents tend to have a more distant relationship with their surrogate. And I think some of that's inevitable because of language differences, but it's also where the process is being managed much more heavily by an organization. It's different to surrogacy in the States where the relationship is at the heart and then you have lots of different professionals supporting it. So it has a kind of very different feel. But for parents who are, struggling to conceive, and bearing in mind Ukraine only supports heterosexual married couples, it's often kind of the solution that is available at the end of a long fertility journey or whatever the background is for them needing surrogacy. It's not far away from the UK, it's affordable, it's legal, and there are agencies offering services to match them with a surrogate and make it happen. So I think it's very easy to see why parents go there and choose that as an option.
No, but they're talking kind of fast forwarding to today with the war, and of course, as you pointed out, the law is still intact. It's not like the war took away any of Ukraine's laws or any of the network and setup that they have, but the risk tolerance of going into a war zone and coming out, trying to get your baby out, being stuck in the Ukraine. Are you still seeing families still wanting to take those risks?
Yeah, I mean, not many. And I think most of the parents that we're seeing at the moment that are still, choosing to take that risk of going to Ukraine are people who were already engaged in a journey before the war started and had to put things on hold. And now they're kind of taking the reassurances that it can be managed safely, that the surrogate will live in the west of Ukraine. They'll make sure that, measures are in place to make it as safe as possible. And some of the parents are people who've got embryos there who perhaps have had a child previously, and this is a sibling. So that there's typically, good reasons why parents are going. And we haven't yet seen anybody that's kind of chosen to go to Ukraine in the context of war as a kind of completely fresh journey. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we do see that, because the other options available are so limited.
Well, you mentioned money, and so, and obviously, before the money issue, there's the primal drive and instinct, what drives people to surrogacy to start with, which is just wanting to be a parent. It drives them to sometimes ignore certain risk factors. And I know you and I are on the same page. There are ways and mechanisms to do safe surrogacy outside of the United States and Canada. I don't want to leave Canada off of that list because parentage-wise, Canada is safe. But when they're picking even riskier locations, sometimes it's hard to I mean, at least my experience, depending on what you think too, it's hard to break through and get them to slow down and think sometimes. in order to do it the right way, in order to control those risks. And
Definitely. And
yeah.
people are, they're so desperate. If they feel like it's the only option available to them, they'll hear what they want to hear, and they'll hear the reassurances of organizations that, may not be true, may not be tested, because that's the message that they want to hear. So I think it's just kind of encouraging people, exactly as you say, to kind of slow down, to verify what they're being told, to ask sensible questions and kind of respond to their gut if things don't feel quite right. And I think, one of the biggest risks is kind of going down a surrogacy path which hasn't been tested. So whether that's working with a new organization or in a new country where, there perhaps isn't law and nobody really knows how it's going to work out. So I think, taking your time to do that due diligence and find other people that have been through the journey, how does this really work in practice? How long does it really take? Kind of verifying that information. I think that's really important. And, I know you do this too, but I think a lot of our role as attorneys is to just encourage people to kind of second guess their thinking, to slow down, to ask those questions, to look at information from multiple sources and not just one, and help them with the kind of questions they should be asking, about the ethics, about the legality, about the timescales, about the safety, and just kind of being sensible. I think, parents who are conceiving a family in this way, in my experience, I'm sure in yours too, really want to do things in the best possible way, but quite often they're scared, they're desperate, they feel like they don't have other choices. So I think it's, about explaining to them that there are lots of choices, but you've got to kind of weigh up the pros and cons of each one of those to choose the path that's going to be the right one for you. And if you're choosing a path that isn't the ideal one, perhaps because your budget isn't huge, that there are things you can do to try and make it as safe as possible along the way.
Well, and I don't want to ignore, every single step you just mentioned is no different when you come to the United States for surrogacy, because all 50 states are different. And we are dramatically different sets of laws across the country. And we have states that are just as risky as going to, I'll throw out Mexico right now because we're working on what is safe and what is not safe in Mexico. But we have states that are identical to that. So it's not just go to the US and suddenly you're safe. You need to do the same due diligence, the same talking to agencies, and not just taking their word for it, reconfirming it. Ask another person. I think that's probably the best piece of advice, right? Ask a second person.
Definitely. And agencies in the States aren't regulated. So, some of them are fantastic and very experienced and know what they're doing. Some of them, they might have set up yesterday and have no experience at all. So it's the same, checking out the organizations that you're placing this enormous trust in is so important. And, just by going to the States, that doesn't absolve you of that responsibility.
Yeah, well, and I, just the other day, one of the statistics I heard at one of the conferences you and I were just at was that they're estimating there's around 800 agencies or programs, whatever you want to call them. They're not regulated, so they're not a regulated agency in the US, but around 800 in the United States right now. And that is mind-blowing compared to when you and I first started doing surrogacy, where it was maybe 20 when I started in 2003. Well, yeah, 3-4, that's when I started the first contract, and the baby was born the next year. But I don't know how many agencies existed at that time, but very few, not even by any means. And like you said, they could have just set up shop yesterday. So other than asking more people, doing a little more due diligence on it, are there other recommendations you give? Because I know you're really good about, it's not just shut the door because they're not going somewhere that's proven and true. You're going to help them and try to figure out and navigate it with them. But what other advice do you give them?
I think I'm very passionate about ensuring that arrangements are ethical. And, I think particularly when you're going to destinations where things are emerging or where there's a kind of bigger disparity in wealth, it gives an even greater responsibility to ask the right questions. And I'm not somebody who thinks that all surrogacy in poorer countries is unethical. That's not what I see on the ground. But I think encouraging parents to think about, who are the women that are acting as surrogates? How are they being recruited by the agencies? How are they supported through the process? Making sure that they meet the surrogate and have a relationship and can verify for themselves kind of why she's doing this, and that she's not kind of being coerced by anybody, and she's, it's something that she wants to do. So I think, we've seen very recently kind of arrangements in places like Africa where the agencies are saying that they have to be completely anonymous and the parents and the surrogate can never meet. And I would always advise against that, because you have no idea then of kind of what's happening in this arrangement and who this woman is who's carrying your child. And that's very rare. That's not something that we've seen until very recently. But I do think it kind of goes to this, you're working together as a team with this amazing woman that's helping you have your family, and you need to make sure that she's looked after and she's okay. And I think that's very important, and you have to kind of ask all the right questions to make sure that you feel confident of that.
Well, and it's kind of that old adage of, if it sounds too good to be true, right? If it's so cheap that you can't believe it, and you're just running towards it because it's so cheap for you. There's something else going on there where the surrogate's not getting fairly compensated. She's not being taken care of. Her expenses are not being taken care of, or something. Because at some point, that money's not making it down the line. And like you said, it's, we have a human rights issue there. We have an ethical duty there. But you do too, intended parents. You've got to decide, what do you want to participate in, and is it worth it? It shouldn't be worth it if it's taking advantage of a surrogate who is going to bring you a baby. Historically, we've had those problems. Historically, we had the problem mainly with India, where it was warehouses, for lack of a better word, of women in cots. Right. And that's not it's not why we make surrogacy legal. Right. I mean, I don't know UK perspective on it. You can tell me, but like in Nevada, where I lobbied, the concept behind making it legal is that you are taking care of her, that she isn't being taken advantage of. And when she has free will and and participates and is making her decisions and deciding to participate, it's very different from a woman that is not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has to be a fair balance of power in that relationship. And there are, people out there who oppose surrogacy who say that there is never a fair balance of power. And that's not what I see on the ground. I think in the States, there are a lot of protections to make sure that everybody has their own independent legal advice, that there's screening, that, that there's a kind of protections built into the system. And I think when you're going to other countries where those mechanisms are not there, you have to be more careful. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's unethical. And we had quite an interesting experience going back to Ukraine and talking about it there, because it's one of the places where people kind of often say, it's all unethical and it's all exploitative. That when the war broke out in Ukraine, we volunteered to help any British parents who were expecting a child. And we ended up working with a group of 46 families. And we had, if you like, a kind of that unique opportunity of having a snapshot of every single British person who was doing surrogacy in Ukraine at that time, over that period of 9 months. And I'd always wondered whether, the kind of people that come and get legal advice from us, are they going to be the more diligent and more careful ones? And are there other people that we don't see that are doing things in a really, a concerning way? And actually what we saw was that where there was variety, it was very much in the quality of the agencies and the support that they were giving. And, some of the agencies were fantastic and some of them just disappeared. And to some extent, you can understand that. I mean, there are also people living in Ukraine who had experienced an invasion and they're looking after their own families and so on. But we didn't see, cases of concerning exploitation. And there were some incredible stories of, families bringing their surrogates to the UK. Some of those surrogates have settled in the UK with their own families permanently as a result of the visas that were granted to them. And, forming really close friendships and relationships, and we saw all the communications kind of between everybody, and it reassured me that actually these women that were doing this in Ukraine were no different to the women in the UK or the US being surrogates. They wanted to help People have a family, and yes, they want to be compensated for that. But they were no different. So I think it's really important when we're looking at surrogacy to kind of get behind the just it's good in this place or it's bad in this place, and actually look at, well, what makes it good or bad? What are we concerned about here in terms of making sure that it's a positive experience for everybody, that it's creating a platform for a child that's going to be loved and wanted, and making sure that that positive arrangement is what you see in the overwhelming majority of cases. And honestly, that is what we see.
Yeah, well, it's okay. So instead of good and bad, we're going to rearrange this. And I would say first, is the surrogate being fairly treated?
Yeah.
Maybe second, maybe citizenship comes before that, even, because if you're going to a location where your child's never going to make it out of that country or back home and be a citizen in your own home country, then that's probably the most critical thing you need to look at. Instead of looking good and bad, the legal structures in the different countries and how they interact with each other on citizenship is key and critical. I don't know which one we put first. Citizenship.
I think it's all important. And I think, a bit more broadly than citizenship, it's kind of like, is there a path to follow that's tested and reliable? Do we know the steps in this process? Do we know what documents are going to be issued after the birth in order to make sure that the child is with their parents and able to leave and go home to whichever the home country is? And it can be very easy where surrogacy is emerging in a new country for agencies to set up and say, yeah, this is how things are going to work. But when they haven't actually tried it, we get involved in so many cases where people are the guinea pigs that are testing things out, and they were promised they could get home in a week, but actually they end up getting stuck for months and months because nobody knew how this was going to actually turn out when the baby was born. So I think from a parent's perspective, making sure that the process that you're going through is tested, it's reliable, other people have done it before, there's clarity in terms of the legal side of things. And I think what's really helpful when you have written law or written case law is that it gives that kind of roadmap for how things are going to work, and you're not just relying on officials who may or may not make a decision in your favor, but you don't quite know what's going to happen. So it's kind of about experience and the testing of the process over time.
Well, and that was the difference with Ukraine, right? And in Mexico, we see that in Mexico City, but not necessarily in the whole country. So we have discrepancies in written law and regulations. What are you seeing? I know Georgia's kind of that fallback location now from the Ukraine. What are you seeing with them?
So Georgia had a similar legal framework to Ukraine, but it was a much smaller country with fewer agencies. So it was happening in a much kind of on a smaller scale. And what's happened because of the war in Ukraine is it's suddenly created this enormous pressure on Georgia to meet all of this unmet demand for the parents that would be going to Ukraine. So the Georgian Prime Minister announced that they were going to ban surrogacy for foreign parents. And that ban was supposed to take effect from the beginning of this year. It hasn't happened. It hasn't come into effect. So we don't really know whether it's been stalled or whether it's not happening at all, or whether there might be a change to regulations. But it creates kind of that uncertainty in terms of parents choosing to go there, because it doesn't look necessarily that it's as stable as it previously was. The other issue that we're seeing is that coming back to this, are the agencies experience that there's lots of new providers that are kind of popping up in Georgia, and some of them not even based in Georgia. So it's quite risky at the moment, I think, for parents to be able to kind of work out who are the people who have genuinely in Georgia and genuinely got experience there, and who are the people that are operating from some other place and not following the kind of requirements.
Back to the due diligence, and both in the laws and in the agencies and the entities that you're working with. All right. So, I want to kind of backpedal a little bit back to just the drive of people. And what are your tactics? Because one of the things that I see is just when we were talking about trying to slow them down, trying to get them to do that due diligence when they're just blind struck with, I might have an opportunity here. And, they look at least in the United States, they look at lawyers often as evil. Lawyers are not who I want to talk to, but they need to, right? because we're a huge part of this, and we're a huge part of the analysis, unfortunately, for them, because people don't always want to work with lawyers. But it's critical timing wise, don't you think, that when do you advise people come talk to you and get that advice from you?
I mean, we get people at all stages, but obviously the earlier you can get the information, the better. And I find that people are really engaged in those conversations. I mean, they're coming to us because they want to know, if I go ahead with this option for building my family, then what's going to happen when my baby's born, and how long am I going to be stuck in this country? And, to be able to provide those answers. So I guess giving the context around, if you do things in the best way, it's going to make things easier. They're looking for those answers. That's why they're kind of coming to us for advice. So, I tend to find people are quite receptive to that, and they kind of want to know. And I guess it's helpful that we have kind of no axe to grind in this. We're not trying to sell them anything. We're trying, we're in their corner as attorneys, and it's about kind of looking after them and caring for them and making sure that they're going into things with their eyes wide open. And I think it really helps to have a lot of experience, because you can kind of touch on stories of other experiences parents have had, and kind of the realities of timescales and some of the difficulties that you've seen other people experience that they can watch out for. And I think people find that really valuable, because it's I often hear people say, look, I've read all this information on the internet and I've talked to these people, but how do I know what's true? And I think they feel like we're the kind of independent outsiders that can, help them fact check what they're being told. So I don't find that it's a kind of a difficult conversation, and actually people are quite receptive to, these are the things you need to ask, these are the things you need to think about.
I find it just the financial argument. They're afraid to how much the bill is going to be. But a lot of us do free consults, or we do reduced fees, or we do flat fees. We make it easier. I did want to kind of pull out one little piece of all that conversation too, which is the social media aspect of it, because it's a colloquialism in the United States, double-edged sword, where it can be very helpful for deciphering and kind of getting to the bottom of the storylines of an agency, and is it legitimate and what's going on with it. And at the same time, there can be some very deceptive information out there when it comes to social media. But we do find, or I find, and I don't know if you have any tricks up your sleeve, it is sometimes hard to figure out a new country that clients have come to you with, and you've never heard of the agency, and best ways to figure that out or get information for them. You have any tricks on that?
No, although, I mean, we've literally just said, talk to people who've been through the process, and the best way to do that is probably going to be on social media.
Yeah.
So, it definitely has a part to play, and it can be really valuable. But equally, people who might be bad actors, or, agencies that are trying to sell things, may be posing as people. So it's, you've got to kind of realize that information online and on forums and so on isn't vetted. You've got to kind of trust your gut, and I think look for as much information from as many different sources as possible, so you can start to kind of distinguish what's genuine and what's not. So I think I wouldn't tell people to kind of ignore any source of information, but I would encourage people to have a skeptical mind with absolutely everything that they're looking at.
Right. Well, and that's back to some of the benefit of talking to lawyers like us, the two of us, who have a very a definite network of lawyers around the world that we work with in many countries, who we can reach out to and say, hey, have you ever heard of this one? Do you have any experience in this one? What's happening with clients in this one?
Yeah, and it's such a small world, because parents all over the world are looking to build families through surrogacy. So if I've got clients going to Georgia, you can bet my Australian colleagues, my Irish colleagues, my French colleagues, they will have clients looking at those destinations as well. And it's a small professional world. We all know each other very well. So when there are difficulties and scandals and those kinds of things, we do hear about them.
And we do worry about them. So I'm not gonna rubber stamp that the entire world, every country is safe to go to by any means, but there is some creativity to help families.
Yeah.
And just kind of circle back to, the financial issue in the United States it's growing. It's a growing concern. The prices are going up. They're continuing to go up. It's not getting better. It's I think I don't know where it caps at. I don't know when we see it kind of exceed its boundaries, but it hasn't right now. And it is outside of the means of a lot of people.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's not that people don't understand the benefits of going to the US. I think for the people that choose not to, it's just not an option. It's never going to be an option. They absolutely can't afford it. And I think also it's not just the cost of the process, but there's financial risk involved in US surrogacy because of the way that your health insurance system works. And, parents coming from outside the US who don't have their own insurance coverage, if there's a problem with their pregnancy or their baby and they don't have good cover, they could be liable for, the kind of sums that will bankrupt people. And that's not a risk that is associated with surrogacy in the UK, for example, where we have the NHS and in many other countries. So I think I think about understanding that it's not just, yes, the US is best, but it's most expensive, that it has its own very particular risks that, people, whichever path they're looking at, they need to understand the implications in order to make a decision about whether that's something that they can cope with or not.
Well, when I do these consults, and the conversation I have with people often is, especially with my international intended parents, is there is nothing about the American health system that makes sense. Our insurance system is nonsensical to anybody else in any other country. It does not match anything else in the world. It doesn't look like things in the rest of the world, and the language is not the same. It is, and not you're going to be hard strapped to find Americans that think it makes sense and it's good for us either. We don't like it. It's not great. It's broken. And it is a major risk that is just, there's the cost. So there's health insurance as a risk. What other things do you see as risky when it comes to the United States?
We've had some parents be worried about children being born with American citizenship. And I know that that's kind of a big bonus in some respects, but also, these days the American authorities are, send their claws out in terms of tax returns and so on. And for some wealthy families, that can be a significant consideration. And I think the biggest risk with the US really is, I mean, as you were talking about those 800 agencies, it's just the wealth of choice. And it's just so overwhelming for parents to be able to kind of say, there's all these different states, all these different laws, all these different providers. Where do I even start with choosing who to work with this kind of most precious of journeys?
Right. And it's super complicated. And if you don't walk in the right door to start with, you may be on the wrong path the entire time and hard to get back on the right path. Back to reaching out to really good resources, people that have resources. And I think a lot of times the lawyers play a better neutral role in that also, because we have a different, like you said it at one point during this, just we don't have the same stake in it. I don't care which fertility clinic people go to, other than to the extent that I want them to go to a good one, right? And not somebody who's pretending to be a great reproductive endocrinologist when really they just figured it out and just opened their clinic. Right?
And it's literally our job description as lawyers to be in the corner of our clients, to represent their interests, to defend them.
We're their advocate. Yes. Yeah. It's our job. It's a very different role from some of the professionals in this industry whose job it is to be somewhat more neutral. They're to navigate the journey as an agency or program for the surrogate and the intended parents. The health insurance is meant for both also, the escrow is meant for both. And so, we have a very different role. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that works really well about the US system is that you have multiple professionals involved with different roles. And actually, it's the kind of teamwork of everybody that makes it work well, because you're not putting the same kind of reliance on one professional or one organization, and it's kind of checks and balances.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's no reason you can't have that also in some of the other countries too. It's if you go into it with the mindset that you want that, and you're in in the Caribbean or you're in Central America, and you say, no, I'll pick my own lawyer. No, I want to interview the doctor, and you want to piece it out, you can. You just need to advocate for yourself. And that's probably some of the best advice we could give for how to successfully navigate journeys in some of these other countries where you can afford it.
Yeah, definitely. I would always suggest getting an independent lawyer who isn't just the agency's in-house lawyer in the country that you're going to verify what you've been told about the legal process and requirements.
Yeah, especially the legal process. The last thing you need is to not be parents at the end of the journey. You don't go through this to not be parents. That's the best piece of advice we can give, is make sure you can go home and be a parent. And because we do have terrible stories that have happened over time in history, and we don't see them often. They're definitely media magnets, the best word I can use, that drives the media right to those bad stories. But with good advocacy and good lawyers, you can survive it. You can make through, and we can help you. All right, my friend, any last pieces of advice before we go?
No, I think just to endorse everything you've said about, people taking their time, verifying information, and just kind of not rushing into things and making sure they keep themselves safe. But yeah, there's lots of different ways of having a family through surrogacy, and it's all about weighing up the pros and cons and understanding kind of what your personal risk tolerance and, your wishes are, so that you find the right journey for you.
Take a deep breath, slow down. It's so hard when you think you've got it right there in front of you and you can just go. Everybody wants to be pregnant yesterday. And I understand there's absolute solid reasons for it. But we have to be the bearer of bad news and say, no, you need to do a little more work first. You got to take a few more steps first. And there's plenty of people who do. There's a lot of people that are they're very good at doing their due diligence. So just keep it up. All right. Well, I appreciate you so much. I can't tell the world how amazing you are. If you didn't figure that out, everyone, from just listening to her bio at the beginning, and just even what she did when it came down to the war in Ukraine, Natalie has a phenomenal resume. And you couldn't be in better hands. And the UK is just blessed and lucky to have had you.
Oh, thank you.
I'm blessed and lucky to have had you as a friend. So now that I'm teary-eyed, I'll tell everybody thank you for joining us on this episode of Surrogacy Warrior. I hope you found our discussion to be enlightening and empowering. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback is what helps us reach more listeners and gives me a good idea of what content you possibly could want to listen to. Stay connected with us. You can find us on social media, or you can find us at www.lawyersforfamilies.com. For more resources and updates, head to those sources. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. Together, we are warriors. Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting for your dreams.
You've been tuning into the Surrogacy Warrior podcast with your host, Kimberly Surratt. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, lawyersforfamilies.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.